Morven Grell pulled his collection cart through the narrow passages of hive quarters, the servo-skull floating beside him casting pale light across the cramped corridors. The skull's red optics swept methodically over the bodies that littered the underhive streets, cataloguing each corpse with dutiful precision. 23 years he had walked these routes, 23 years of harvesting the Emperors, faithful for the greater good of the Imperium. His first stop was Sector 7 Alpha, where the night shift workers had deposited another dozen bodies outside the hab blocks. Morven examined each corpse, checking for signs of mutation, disease, or heretical markings that would render them unsuitable for processing. The servo-skull designated Harvester Prime hovered over his shoulder, its Vox grill crackling as it recorded the identification numbers branded into each victim's forearm. Male, approximately 40 Terran years, cause of termination malnutrition. Morven spoke aloud for the skull's records. He rolled the body onto his cart with ease, joints creaking from decades of this work. Female, juvenile, termination cause industrial accident, suitable for processing. Another body joined the first. The cart's ancient wheels groaned under the growing weight. The routine continued through 6 more sectors. Harvester Prime's memory banks filled with the day's collection data, while Morven loaded corpse after corpse. His mind wandered to the processing quotas, the delivery schedules, the endless forms that needed completion before the bodies could be rendered into corpse-starch. The Departamento Munitorum demanded efficiency above all else, and Morven had built his reputation on exceeding their expectations. As he hefted a particularly heavy corpse onto the cart, movement flickered in his peripheral vision. Morven glanced toward the shadows between 2 collapsed buildings, but saw nothing except rust-stained metal and pooled water. Harvester Prime continued its methodical documentation, unperturbed by whatever had caught Morven's attention. He shrugged and returned to his work, attributing the distraction to fatigue. The collection cart was nearly full when Morven reached his final stop of the morning shift. The corpse-starch processing facility loomed ahead, its massive bulk carved from the hive's supporting structure. Smoke rose from 100 pipes, while the thunder of industrial machinery echoed through the air. Morven had delivered thousands of bodies to this facility over the years, each one destined to feed the endless hunger of the Imperium's citizens. He guided his cart toward the receiving bay, where Tech Adept Vontner waited with a data slate in his augmetic hands. The Adeptus Mechanicus priest's robes hung loosely over his extensively modified frame, hiding the extent of his mechanical augmentations. His voice emerged from a Vox grill mounted where his mouth had once been, words rendered in monotone precision. Collector Grell, your morning harvest stands at 37 units, Vontner stated, scanning the bodies with optical sensors. Quality assessment indicates 92% suitability for standard processing. The remaining units will be redirected to alternate applications. Morven nodded and began unloading the cart, while facility workers moved the approved bodies toward the processing chambers. The rejected corpses would be sent to the corpse-starch refineries, where even the most degraded remains could be rendered into something useful. Nothing was wasted in the Imperium, especially not the dead. The processing facility's interior was a cathedral of industrial might. Massive conveyor systems carried bodies through various stages of preparation, while tech priests supervised the sacred work of transformation. The air thrummed with the sound of cutting blades, grinding wheels, and chemical baths. Morven had long ago stopped feeling revulsion at the sight of human remains being systematically dismantled and processed. It was the Emperor's will that the dead should serve the living, even in death. He watched a conveyor belt carry a familiar-looking corpse toward the primary processing chamber. The body belonged to a woman, perhaps 40 years old, with distinctive scars across her left cheek. Something about her face nagged at Morven's memory, but he dismissed the feeling. After collecting bodies for over 2 decades, faces tended to blur together into an endless parade of the dead. Tech Adept Vontner approached with Morven's next assignment, a data slate containing coordinates for the afternoon collection route. The Emperor's blessings upon your labors, Collector Grell, the tech priest intoned. May your harvest prove bountiful. Morven accepted the assignment and guided his empty cart back into the underhive's twisted passages. The afternoon route would take him through the lower industrial sectors where workplace accidents provided a steady supply of fresh corpses. The manufactorums never ceased their production, and neither did their contribution to Morven's daily quota. His servoskull preceded him through the narrow corridors, its searchlight illuminating patches of rust and decay. Harvester Prime had served faithfully for 15 years, its machine spirit blessed by the tech priests, and its memory banks expanded to accommodate ever-growing record requirements. The skull was Morven's only constant companion in the lonely work of corpse collection. The first industrial site yielded 6 bodies, victims of a promethium leak that had filled an entire section with toxic fumes. Morven examined each corpse carefully, noting the distinctive blue discoloration that marked promethium poisoning. The bodies would be suitable for processing after appropriate decontamination procedures. He loaded them methodically while Harvester Prime recorded the relevant data. At the second site, a collapsed scaffold had crushed 3 workers beneath twisted metal beams. Their bodies showed extensive trauma, but the damage was primarily skeletal rather than tissue degradation. Morven added them to his collection while mentally calculating his progress toward the day's quota. 9 bodies collected, 28 still needed to meet minimum requirements. As he worked, that same flicker of movement teased his peripheral vision. This time Morven turned quickly, scanning the shadows for whatever had caught his attention. A figure seemed to stand between 2 massive support pillars, watching him with unblinking eyes. When Morven focused directly on the location, he saw only empty space and drifting steam. Fatigue degradation detected, he muttered to himself, echoing the clinical language of the tech priests. Too many double shifts were affecting his perception. He would need to request rest rotation once the current quota period ended. The afternoon collection continued through 6 more sites. Industrial accidents, workplace murders, and the occasional natural death provided a steady stream of bodies for Morven's cart. Each corpse received the same thorough examination, the same careful cataloguing, the same efficient loading onto the growing pile. By the time Morven reached his final collection point, his cart held 31 bodies, and his quota satisfaction was guaranteed. The last site was a hab block where an entire family had perished in their sleep, apparently from toxic gas accumulation. Morven found them still in their beds, faces peaceful despite the blue tinge around their lips. A man, woman, and 2 children, all claimed by the hive's endless hazards. He carried each body to his cart with unusual gentleness, though he could not explain why these particular corpses deserved special consideration. As Morven arranged the children's bodies on top of the pile, he caught sight of a figure standing across the narrow street. The woman watched him with familiar scarred features, the same distinctive marks he had noticed on the conveyor belt that morning. She stood perfectly still, neither moving nor speaking, simply observing his work with dead eyes. Morven blinked hard and looked again. The street was empty except for his cart and the ever-present shadows of the underhive. Harvester Prime showed no signs of detecting any additional human presence, its sensors focused solely on the task of corpse documentation. Morven shook his head and returned to securing the bodies for transport. The return journey to the processing facility took longer than usual. His cart's wheels had developed an irritating squeak that echoed through the corridors, and several times Morven thought he heard footsteps matching his pace. When he stopped to listen, the sounds ceased immediately. When he resumed walking, the phantom footsteps returned after a few moments. Tech Adept Vontner met him at the receiving bay as before, conducting the same ritual of assessment and approval. 31 bodies transferred to the processing chambers, efficiency ratings maintained, quotas exceeded by 3 units. Another successful day in service to the Emperor's will. Morven completed his shift reports in the facility's administrative section, filling out the endless forms that documented every aspect of his collection activities. Body identification numbers, collection locations, condition assessments, processing recommendations, transport efficiency ratings, all reduced to neat columns of data that will be transmitted to the Departamento Munitorum for review. As he worked through the paperwork, Morven found his attention drifting to the processing chambers visible through reinforced windows. Bodies moved along conveyor belts in various stages of dismantlement, tended by robed tech priests and their servitor assistants. The sacred work of transformation continued without pause, converting the dead into sustenance for the living. He thought he saw the scarred woman again, her body moving along one of the conveyor systems toward the primary cutting stations. But when Morven pressed closer to the window for a better view, he could not identify her among the dozens of corpses being processed simultaneously. The industrial machinery continued its relentless work, indifferent to his observation. Morven finished his reports and prepared to return to his hab unit for the regulation rest period. His next shift would begin in 8 hours, another day of collection and delivery in service to the Imperium's needs. He had performed this routine thousands of times without significant incident, and there was no reason to expect tomorrow would be different. The journey to his hab unit took him through the residential sectors, where off-shift workers crowded the narrow passages. Morven pushed through the crowds with practiced ease, his collector's robes and cart marking him as one of the hive's essential functionaries. Most citizens gave him a wide berth, unwilling to associate too closely with one who handled the dead professionally. His hab unit was a small but adequate space on sub-level 47, equipped with basic amenities and a secure storage area for his equipment. Morven sealed the door behind him and activated the chamber's purification systems, standard procedure after exposure to potentially contaminated corpses. The familiar hum of air recyclers and water filtration units provided a comforting background noise. He prepared a simple meal from regulation ration packs, the same corpse-starch derivatives he helped produce through his daily labors. The irony was not lost on him that he consumed the processed remains of people he had personally collected, though the thought had long ago ceased to disturb him. The Imperium's citizens served in life and death, contributing to the greater good through every possible means. As Morven ate his meal, he reviewed the next day's collection assignments on his personal data slate. 6 sectors required attention, including 2 industrial zones where workplace accidents were statistically likely to occur. The morning route would take him through areas he had not visited in several weeks, potentially yielding corpses in various stages of decomposition. A soft sound from the hab unit's main chamber drew his attention. Morven looked up from his data slate, but saw nothing unusual, just the familiar arrangement of furniture and personal belongings. The purification systems continued their steady operation, while recycled air circulated through the small space. He returned to his meal and assignment review. The sound repeated, a barely audible whisper of movement that seemed to come from near the sealed door. Morven set aside his food and approached the entrance, checking the locking mechanisms and security indicators. All systems showed normal status, no unauthorized access detected. The corridor beyond remained empty according to the door's scanner display. He returned to his meal with a growing sense of unease. The day's collection had proceeded normally, quotas met and efficiency maintained, yet something felt subtly wrong. Perhaps the extended shifts were affecting his judgment more than he had realized. Rest rotation would need to be requested soon, before fatigue degradation impacted his work performance. After completing his evening meal, Morven prepared for the regulation sleep period. His collection robes were secured in their storage cabinet, while his personal effects were arranged according to established routine. Harvester Prime settled into its charging alcove, red optics dimming as the servoskull entered maintenance mode. Morven sealed himself into the sleeping chamber and activated the noise-dampening systems. The hab unit fell silent, except for the essential life support functions that maintained atmospheric pressure and temperature. He had learned long ago to sleep despite the constant mechanical sounds of hive operation, but tonight something made rest elusive. Hours passed in fitful dozing, punctuated by moments of unclear wakefulness. Morven thought he heard voices whispering beyond the sealed door, conversations in languages he could not identify. When he activated the door scanner, the corridor appeared empty as always. The security systems reported no unusual activity in the residential sector. Near the end of the sleep period, Morven woke to find his chamber had grown unnaturally cold. His breath misted in the chilled air, while ice crystals formed on the walls around his sleeping alcove. The environmental controls showed normal temperature readings, but his body shivered involuntarily as freezing air filled his lungs. A figure stood at the foot of his sleeping alcove, partially visible in the chamber's dim lighting. The scarred woman from the processing facility watched him with unblinking eyes. She made no sound and showed no signs of breathing, simply maintained her vigil over his restless sleep. Morven blinked hard and sat up in his alcove, heart racing from the sudden awakening. The chamber was empty, except for his own presence. Temperature readings normal, no signs of unauthorized entry. The sealed door remained secure while the purification systems operated within acceptable parameters. He had been dreaming, nothing more. The wake cycle alarm sounded as scheduled, signaling the beginning of another collection shift. Morven prepared himself, consuming regulation nutrients and reviewing his assignment data. Harvester Prime emerged from maintenance mode and conducted its standard system checks, sensors calibrated, and memory banks cleared for new data acquisition. The morning collection route led through sectors Morven had not visited in several weeks. Bodies had accumulated in the deeper passages where scavengers and maintenance crews rarely ventured, providing rich harvesting opportunities for a dedicated collector. His cart's wheels squeaked rhythmically as he navigated the narrow corridors toward his first collection point. The initial site yielded 12 corpses in various stages of decomposition, victims of a water contamination incident that had poisoned an entire hab block. Morven examined each body carefully, noting the distinctive skin discoloration and tissue degradation that marked toxic exposure. Most would require extensive processing to remove contaminants before rendering into corpse-starch. As he loaded the bodies onto his cart, Morven noticed movement in the shadows nearby. Several figures stood watching his work, their faces bearing the same blue-tinged pallor as the contamination victims. They made no attempt to approach or interfere, simply observed his collection activities with patient attention. Morven turned to address the watchers, but found the shadows empty. Harvester Prime showed no signs of detecting additional human presence, its sensors focused entirely on corpse documentation. The servoskull's behavioral patterns remained normal, suggesting that whatever Morven had seen existed only in his own perception. The second collection site contained evidence of gang violence, bodies bearing Lars-burn wounds and blade injuries scattered throughout a large chamber. Morven recognized the territorial markings on the walls, symbols of the Crimson Reaper's gang that had controlled this sector during his own youth in the underhive. Many of the corpses wore the same ritual scarification he had once carried proudly. Among the dead, he found faces that stirred distant memories. Jack Morn, Sierra Vole, and others whose names escaped him, but whose features remained etched in his memory from decades past. Morven loaded their bodies with unusual care, arranging them respectfully on his cart, despite the practical demands of efficient transport. These had been his people once, before Imperial service offered an escape from gang life and the constant threat of violent death. Now they joined the endless stream of corpses that fed the Imperium's machinery. As he worked, the watchers gathered in greater numbers. They stood at the edges of his vision, familiar faces from his collection routes over the years. The scarred woman was there, along with the contamination victims from the morning's first sight. Others he recognized, but could not immediately place, a growing crowd of silent observers. When Morven looked directly at them, they faded like smoke, leaving only empty spaces and drifting shadows. But their presence remained, a weight of attention that followed his every movement. Harvester Prime continued its documentation duties without acknowledging the phantom audience, mechanical systems untroubled by whatever haunted Morven's perception. The third collection site was a manufactorum where industrial equipment had malfunctioned catastrophically, crushing workers beneath collapsed machinery. Morven spent considerable time extracting bodies from the twisted metal, work that required both strength and careful technique to avoid damaging tissue unnecessarily. The watchers grew bolder as his collection continued. They approached closer to his cart, surrounding his work area in a loose circle of silent observation. Morven could see them clearly now without needing to rely on peripheral vision. Dozens of corpses he had collected over the years standing motionless in the Manufactorum's ruins. Among them, he recognized the burned family from Sector 7 Alpha, their flesh still bearing the marks of the fire that had claimed their lives. The contamination victims stood nearby, skin blue-tinged and eyes vacant. Gang members displayed their fatal wounds proudly, Lars burns and blade cuts visible on their motionless forms. They showed no signs of hostility or malevolent intent, simply watched his work with patient interest. Some gestured toward the bodies he was collecting, others pointed in directions he had not yet explored. Their actions seemed designed to assist rather than hinder his collection efforts, though Morven could not understand their purpose. Harvester Prime suddenly emitted a burst of electronic static, its optical sensors flickering erratically. The servoskull spun in an uncontrolled circle before stabilizing, memory banks apparently corrupted by some form of interference. When its systems restored normal function, the skull resumed documentation duties as if nothing had occurred. Morven examined his mechanical companion with growing concern. Harvester Prime had operated flawlessly for 15 years, its machine spirit blessed by the tech priests and maintained according to strict protocols. Sudden malfunctions suggested either component degradation or external interference, both of which required immediate attention. The skull's sensors swept across the Manufactorum ruins, recording data on the extracted corpses. But occasionally, its optical array would focus on empty spaces where Morven saw the watchers standing, as if the servoskull could detect something its sensors could not properly interpret. Collection continued through the remainder of the morning shift. Bodies accumulated on Morven's cart while the watchers observed every aspect of his work. Their numbers grew with each new collection site, a silent procession of the dead that followed his route through the underhive's twisted passages. Some of the watchers were corpses he had collected recently, their faces still fresh in his memory. Others came from years past, bodies he had almost forgotten until their reappearance stirred dormant recollections. By the time Morven reached the processing facility, his cart carried 43 bodies and his phantom escort numbered in the hundreds. The watchers gathered outside the facility's entrance, forming ranks that stretched back into the underhive's shadows. They made no attempt to enter the sacred precincts of the Adeptus Mechanicus, but their presence was unmistakable. Tech Adept Vontner conducted the standard assessment ritual, approving 39 bodies for primary processing while designating 4 for alternative applications. The rejected corpses showed signs of mutation or disease that rendered them unsuitable for standard corpse-starch production, but they would still serve the Imperium's needs through other means. As Morven unloaded his cart, he watched the approved bodies move along conveyor systems toward the processing chambers. The watchers pressed closer to the facility's windows, observing the industrial machinery with intense interest. Some pointed urgently at specific corpses, their gestures becoming increasingly agitated. The scarred woman stood at the front of the phantom crowd, her attention fixed on a particular conveyor belt that carried freshly collected bodies toward the primary cutting stations. She raised one arm and pointed repeatedly at the processing chamber beyond, her mouth moving silently as if trying to communicate something important. Morven followed her gesture and saw the conveyor system carrying bodies through what appeared to be the standard preparation sequence. Tech priests supervised the sacred work, while servitors performed routine dismantlement procedures. Nothing seemed unusual about the process, yet the watchers' agitation continued to increase. Harvester Prime emitted another burst of static, its optical sensors focusing intently on the processing chambers. The servoskull's behavioral patterns had become increasingly erratic throughout the morning, suggesting that whatever affected Morven's perception was also influencing his mechanical companion. Tech Adept Vontner approached with the afternoon collection assignments, his augmetic features showing no sign of awareness regarding the phantom audience. The tech priest handed over the data slate, untroubled by whatever supernatural disturbances plagued Morven's experience. "The Emperor's blessings upon your labors, Collector Grell," Vontner intoned through his vox grill. "May your harvest prove bountiful and your service exemplary." Morven accepted the assignment and prepared to depart for his afternoon collection route. The watchers remained gathered outside the processing facility, their attention focused entirely on the industrial machinery within. As his cart moved away from the building, most of the phantom crowd remained behind, while only a few followed his progress. The afternoon route led through residential sectors where domestic violence and industrial accidents provided a steady supply of fresh corpses. Morven's collection proceeded, while the remaining watchers observed his every movement. Their numbers gradually increased as he harvested bodies from each new location. At a hab block where toxic gas had claimed an entire family, Morven found the victims arranged peacefully in their beds, exactly as he had discovered the similar scene days earlier. The man, woman, and 2 children showed the same blue discoloration around their lips, apparently claimed by the same environmental hazard. As he loaded the family's bodies onto his cart, Morven realized these were the same corpses he had collected previously. The identification numbers branded into their forearms matched his records exactly. Yet here they were again, dead in the same location and bearing identical injuries. Confusion clouded his thoughts as he attempted to reconcile this impossible situation. Bodies could not return to their death locations after processing, yet the evidence was undeniable. These were the same people he had delivered to Tech Adept Vontner just days earlier, now somehow restored to their original state. The watchers pressed closer, their gestures becoming more urgent and insistent. They pointed toward the processing facility, then back at the restored corpses, as if trying to communicate some vital connection between these events. Their silent expressions conveyed desperate need to convey information that Morven could not understand. Harvester Prime's sensors swept across the scene, recording data that should not exist. The servoskull's memory banks contained clear records of these same bodies being processed successfully, yet here they were again requiring collection. The contradiction threatened the skull's logical matrices, causing further system instabilities. Collection continued despite the growing impossibilities that surrounded Morven's work. Each new site yielded bodies that seemed familiar, corpses he was certain he had harvested before yet found again in their original death locations. His cart filled with duplicated deaths while his phantom escort grew ever larger. The watchers no longer remained at the edges of his vision, but surrounded his work area directly, pointing and gesturing with increasing desperation. Their silent communication attempts became more elaborate, acting out scenes that seemed designed to convey crucial information about the processing facility and the fate of the dead. Some watchers mimicked the motions of industrial machinery, their bodies moving in the rhythm of cutting blades and grinding wheels. Others pointed repeatedly at specific corpses on Morven's cart, then gestured toward the processing facility with expressions of obvious distress. The scarred woman appeared frequently among the phantom crowd, her blue-tinged features bearing an expression of urgent warning. She approached Morven's cart directly, reaching toward the loaded bodies with hands that seemed solid but cast no shadows. Her mouth moved continuously in silent speech, words that Morven could not hear but desperately wanted to understand. As the afternoon collection neared completion, Morven's confusion had grown into genuine fear. The normal routines of his work had become a nightmare of impossible repetitions and supernatural encounters. Bodies returned from processing, watchers gathered in impossible numbers, and his servoskull systems degraded under the weight of contradictory data. The return journey to the processing facility became a procession of the dead. Hundreds of watchers followed his cart through the underhive's passages, their numbers including every corpse Morven had collected over his 23 years of service. They filled the narrow corridors completely, a silent army of his professional service. At the facility's entrance, the watchers pressed against the building's walls with obvious distress. They pointed at the processing chambers beyond while their expressions conveyed desperate urgency. Some attempted to enter the sacred precincts, but seemed unable to cross the threshold, as if invisible barriers prevented their passage. Tech Adept Vontner conducted the standard assessment ritual despite the supernatural chaos surrounding the facility. The tech priest showed no awareness of the phantom crowd, his augmetic sensors apparently unable to detect their presence. As the approved corpses moved along conveyor systems toward the processing chambers, the Watchers' agitation reached a crescendo. They pressed against the facility's windows, pointing urgently at the industrial machinery, while their silent mouths formed words of obvious warning. Morven watched a familiar body move along one of the conveyor belts, a gang member he had collected that morning. The corpse disappeared into the primary cutting chamber, where sacred work would transform it into useful materials for the Imperium. Minutes later, the same body emerged on a different conveyor, apparently unchanged by the processing that should have dismantled it completely. The impossible sight shattered Morven's understanding of the facility's operations. Bodies were entering the processing chambers, but not being properly transformed, somehow emerging intact despite the industrial machinery that should have rendered them into component materials. The sacred work of the Adeptus Mechanicus was failing in ways that defied explanation. Harvester Prime spun frantically, its optical sensors attempting to record data that violated basic principles of physical reality. The servoskull's memory banks overloaded with contradictory information, while its machine spirit struggled to maintain logical coherence. Electronic screams emerged from its Vox Grell as system failures cascaded through its neural networks. The Watchers suddenly surged forward, pressing against the facility's barriers with renewed determination. Their expressions had changed from desperate pleading to obvious terror, faces contorted with fear of whatever horrors were being perpetrated within the processing chambers. Tech Adept Vontner approached Morven with the next day's collection assignments. The tech priest's mechanical features showed no sign of awareness regarding the phantom army that filled the facility's entrance area. Collector Grell, your recent efficiency ratings have shown concerning degradation, Vontner stated through his Vox Grell. The Departamento Munitorum requires explanation for your declining performance metrics. Morven struggled to form a coherent response, while hundreds of dead faces stared at him from beyond the tech priest's mechanical perception. How could he explain impossible repetitions, phantom watchers, and processing failures that only he seemed able to observe? Fatigue degradation affects my perception, he managed to say, echoing the clinical language he hoped would satisfy his supervisor. Rest rotation may be required to maintain optimal function. Tech Adept Vontner processed this information, augmetic systems evaluating Morven's statement against established protocols. After several seconds of electronic calculation, the tech priest rendered his judgment. Rest rotation denied pending quota fulfillment, Vontner declared. The Emperor's work permits no inefficiency. Your collection duties will continue as assigned. The tech priest departed while Morven stood surrounded by the army of watchers, their expressions conveying shared horror at whatever unholy processes were occurring within the facility. The scarred woman approached him directly, her blue-tinged features bearing an expression of desperate urgency. She pointed toward a section of the facility that Morven had never entered, an area beyond the standard processing chambers where additional machinery operated behind sealed barriers. Her gestures indicated something crucial was occurring in those restricted sections, something that explained the impossible repetitions and processing failures. Morven found himself following the woman's guidance, moving through facility corridors he had never explored during his decades of service. The Watchers formed a protective escort around him, their presence somehow granting access to areas that should have been forbidden to civilian collectors. The restricted section contained machinery unlike anything Morven had seen in the standard processing chambers. Elaborate devices surrounded platforms where bodies were arranged in ritualistic patterns, attended by figures in robes that bore symbols he did not recognize. The sacred work of the Adeptus Mechanicus had been perverted into something darker and more sinister. Tech priests moved among the ritual platforms, but their augmentations bore markings that seemed wrong somehow. Strange symbols decorated their mechanical limbs, while their vox grills emitted chanting in languages that hurt to hear. The blessed servants of the Omnissiah had been corrupted by influences that violated every principle of Imperial faith. Bodies on the ritual platforms showed signs of unnatural preservation, maintained in states between life and death that allowed for continued torment. The corpses Morven had delivered were not being processed into corpse-starch, but were instead being used in blasphemous ceremonies that trapped their souls in endless suffering. The Watchers pressed closer, their expressions confirming his horrified realization. They were not phantoms haunting his perception, but were the actual souls of the dead, unable to find peace because their physical remains were being desecrated in service to dark powers. Their desperate attempts at communication had been warnings about the corruption that had infected the processing facility. Morven backed away from the ritual chambers while the corrupted tech priests continued their blasphemous work. The magnitude of the heresy was beyond his comprehension, a violation of Imperial doctrine that threatened the very foundations of civilized existence. Every body he had delivered over 23 years had contributed to this abomination. The scarred woman gestured urgently toward a communication terminal in an adjacent chamber, her intentions clear despite her inability to speak. Morven understood that he needed to report this corruption to higher authorities, to alert the Imperium's defenders about the heretical activities occurring beneath their notice. The terminal required authorization codes that Morven did not possess, but the Watchers seemed to guide his hands across the control surfaces. Their collective knowledge somehow enabled access to communication channels reserved for emergency reports to the Adeptus Arbites and other enforcement agencies. Morven composed his report with shaking hands, documenting the ritual chambers, corrupted tech priests, and blasphemous ceremonies he had witnessed. The words seemed inadequate to convey the full scope of the heresy, but he included every detail he could remember about the facility's hidden operations. As he transmitted the report, alarms began sounding throughout the facility. The corrupted tech priests had detected unauthorized access to their restricted sections and were responding. Morven heard the heavy footsteps of security servitors approaching his location, while emergency protocols sealed blast doors throughout the complex. The Watchers surrounded him protectively, their phantom forms providing cover as he fled through corridors that led toward the facility's exterior. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, while augmetic voices coordinated the search with inhuman determination. Morven emerged into the underhive's passages with hundreds of dead souls escorting his escape. The facility's security forces would not pursue him far into the civilian sectors, but he knew that his action had marked him for elimination. The corrupted tech priests would not allow their heresy to be exposed. The flight through the underhive became a desperate race against mechanical pursuers who knew every passage and monitoring station. Watchers guided him through passages he had never used, leading him deeper into the hive's abandoned sections, where ancient machinery had long since fallen silent. Their phantom forms could scout ahead without triggering detection systems, providing early warning of ambush points and patrols. Hours passed in exhausting flight, while Morven navigated the deepest levels of the underhive. His pursuers maintained their search with relentless determination, mechanical systems untroubled by fatigue or emotional stress. A new sound echoed through the passages, the distinctive thunder of orbital engines conducting atmospheric descent, their blessed machinery bringing the Emperor's justice to worlds that harbored heresy. His report had apparently reached the appropriate authorities. The Watchers reacted with obvious relief, their expressions shifting from desperate fear to something approaching peace. They had accomplished their goal of exposing the corruption, and the Imperium's defenders were responding with appropriate force. Their vigil over Morven's survival was nearly complete. Inquisition forces deployed throughout the underhive with overwhelming authority, their movements coordinated by enhanced humans and servoskulls equipped with the most advanced detection systems. Within minutes, they had established perimeters around the processing facility while assault teams prepared for systematic purification. An Inquisitor approached Morven's hiding place, flanked by power-armored warriors whose weapons were awe-inspiring. The man's face bore the ritual scarring of the Ordo Hereticus, while his eyes held the cold certainty of one who had seen too much corruption. His voice carried absolute authority when he spoke. "Collector Grell, you will accompany us for interrogation and debriefing," the Inquisitor commanded. "Your report of heretical activities requires thorough investigation." Morven emerged from concealment with hands raised in submission, grateful that the Imperium's defenders had arrived in time to prevent the corruption from spreading further. The Watchers remained visible around him, their phantom forms finally showing signs of fading as justice approached. The interrogation chamber was a sterile environment equipped with devices that could extract truth from even the most resistant subjects. Morven submitted to the process willingly, eager to provide every detail that might assist in rooting out the heretical corruption. He described the ritual chambers, corrupted tech priests, and blasphemous ceremonies he had witnessed. The Inquisitor listened intensely, recording every word while augmetic sensors monitored Morven's physiological responses for signs of deception. The questions grew increasingly detailed as the interrogation progressed, probing every aspect of his experience with the supernatural Watchers and impossible repetitions. Hours passed in exhaustive examination while Morven recounted every detail of his discoveries. The Inquisitor showed particular interest in the ritual chambers and the corrupted tech priests who had perverted the sacred work of corpse processing. Each answer led to additional questions that explored ever deeper aspects of the heretical corruption. Through reinforced windows, Morven could see Inquisition forces conducting systematic purification of the processing facility. Flamers bathed the ritual chambers in cleansing fire, while melter charges reduced corrupted machinery to slag. While the blessed work of the Emperor's servants proceeded, the Watchers had faded almost completely, their phantom forms growing translucent as the source of their torment was finally addressed. The scarred woman stood at the edge of visibility, her blue-tinged features showing something that might have been gratitude before she dissolved entirely into the chamber's sterile air. "Your cooperation has been noted, Collector Grell," the Inquisitor stated when the interrogation reached its conclusion. "The information you provided will assist in rooting out this corruption completely." Morven felt relief flooding through his exhausted frame. 23 years of faithful service had culminated in this moment of vindication, his actions helping to preserve the Imperium from heretical contamination. The dead could finally rest in peace, while the living remained protected from blasphemous influences. The Inquisitor rose from his seat, power armor servos whining softly as he moved toward the chamber's sealed exit. His scarred features showed no emotion, while augmetic implants processed the interrogation data. When he spoke again, his words carried the cold certainty of absolute judgment. "However, your extended exposure to warp-tainted influences has rendered you spiritually compromised," the Inquisitor continued. "The corruption may have taken root despite your apparent resistance to its effects." Horror began to replace relief as Morven understood the implications of this assessment. The Inquisition did not distinguish between willing servants of chaos and innocent victims of exposure. Both represented potential threats that required elimination. "I served faithfully," Morven protested, desperation creeping into his voice. "I reported the heresy as soon as I discovered it. My loyalty to the Emperor has never wavered." The Inquisitor's expression remained unchanged, mechanical impassivity, untroubled by appeals to mercy or justice. His augmetic sensors had detected traces of warp exposure that marked Morven as potentially dangerous, and the Ordo Hereticus responded to such threats with absolute pragmatism. "Your loyalty is not in question," the Inquisitor replied, "but the enemy's corruption operates beyond conscious awareness. You may serve as an unwitting vector for heretical influences without any intention of betrayal." Guards in power armor entered the interrogation chamber, their weapons trained on Morven despite his obvious helplessness. These were the Emperor's chosen warriors, blessed servants whose duty required them to eliminate any threat to Imperial stability. His cooperation meant nothing in the face of potential corruption. The processing facility and surrounding sectors will be subjected to orbital bombardment, the Inquisitor announced. All traces of heretical influence must be purged to prevent further contamination. Sickly revelation fell upon Morven as he realized that his faithful service had condemned not only himself, but many thousands of innocent citizens who lived in the affected sectors. The Inquisition's response to chaos corruption was always thorough, sacrificing countless lives to ensure that heretical influences could not spread. The facility that had processed bodies for decades would be reduced to molten slag, along with the residential areas surrounding it. Families who had never encountered corruption would die in cleansing flames, because their proximity to heresy marked them as potential threats. As the guards prepared to escort him to whatever fate awaited spiritually compromised individuals, Morven caught a final glimpse of the Watchers. They had not faded completely as he had believed, but remained visible at the edges of his perception. Their expressions no longer showed gratitude, but conveyed profound sorrow for what his actions had unleashed. The scarred woman appeared one last time, her blue-tinged features bearing an expression of terrible understanding. The Inquisition's response would destroy far more than the heretical influences they sought to eliminate. Morven was led through corridors filled with the bustle of military preparation. Inquisition forces loaded exotic weapons while tech priests calibrated targeting systems for the coming bombardment. The blessed servants of the Emperor worked to ensure that no trace of corruption would survive their purification. The transport ship that would carry him away from the doomed hive was a vessel of intimidating size, its hull decorated with the symbols of the Ordo Hereticus and equipped with holy weapons that could level continents. Morven was secured in a holding cell deep within the ship's armored core, surrounded by other prisoners whose only crime had been exposure to heretical influences. The orbital bombardment began as scheduled, lance strikes and torpedo barrages reducing entire city blocks to molten craters. The hive's population centers vanished in brilliant flashes while the ship's crew monitored their targeting displays with professional satisfaction. Another world had been cleansed of heretical taint, thoughts of his home being burnt beneath the righteous fury of Imperial justice, searing into his mind as Morven sat, awaiting his final sentencing.